Good afternoon. This is Joshua Walker at the Japan Society. Well, actually, I'm not at Japan Society. Like all of you, I'm actually at home. And I'm particularly excited about today's event. We're going to be talking about promoting our mission in the age of COVID-19, U.S. relations with Japan, Asia, and the world. And I couldn't be more excited than to talk to the two presenters that I'll be talking to in just a second. But I wanted to do just a bit of housekeeping up front. Number one, I want to thank you for joining us. We have well over 400 participants. You've sent in amazing questions that are going to make us think in different ways. The opportunity that we have today to listen to leaders of organizations that are all brought together to talk about U.S. relations in regions and countries in the entire world seem particularly relevant today. And we at the Japan Society are particularly excited to be hosting and to bring these leaders together, because this is exactly the type of opportunity that we're hoping that COVID is remembered for, not for the moments of isolation and social distancing, but bringing us together. You know, the last time Japan Society had to close our doors was during World War II, which puts things in perspective for an organization like ours. I'm sure we'll hear the same from our leaders talking about the experience of Asia Society in this moment and through crisis throughout history, and also the World Affairs Council. So without further ado, let me start by introducing our speakers for today. The first is Ambassador Josette Shireen, who's the president of Asia Society and has had a long and distinguished career before that at the U.S. Department of State, also at the World Food Organization, and then Bill Clifford, president of the World Affairs Council of America, who also is a journalist and was an Asia bureau chief. So we have kind of an Asian theme going on here, which seems appropriate to start there and to start with Josette. Josette, how are you holding up? What's going on in terms of your world? And then how has this impacted Asia Society as you think about the entire world that has literally changed in the last 6 weeks?
Well, Joshua, first let me thank you for bringing us together. This is really actually a rare thing. It's never happened before that our three organizations, who were born in different eras, out of different wars and different crises in the world, are coming together to talk about this one. And so your institution has been around for more than a century, and it has such a storied history of trying to build bridges of understanding and peace through trial after trial. And that's certainly the history of Asia Society. And I know the World Affairs Councils were born also to involve every American in the discussion about where we head. I've never seen America more activated saying, what's happening in the world and how are we affected? And even though, we're in a time where I think we're less multilateral, if you will, than in the past, there's a real sense that we're in this together for better or worse. And so one thing that's activated, I think, is, at least with our mission, a real need to understand better these connections and how to solve problems and how to save lives. So at Asia Society, we in particular are positioned as an institution with real bridges and boards and centers throughout Asia and the US. And we were asked early on, for example, by the governor of New York to help him understand how to get life-saving supplies. This happened to fit with my background as head of the World Food Program, which is the biggest humanitarian supply chain in the world. But he was right in February when he said we have to start now bringing in this equipment that can save lives. That is so vital in that. So we didn't expect for this past month and a half to really be helping the states of America. We've helped New York in particular, and California and New Jersey and others to figure out how to connect in to life-saving supply chains. But also we've been focused on, very high-level diplomacy on the principle that when lives are at stake, we have to figure out how to solve the problem. And there will be a time to look at the causes and how we got in this situation with COVID. But right now, we've been really working on trying to open those bridges. For us institutionally, like every other institution, New York's been in such a shock throughout our network. It hit hard first in Hong Kong and has spread since January throughout our network. And so our hearts really go out to all of those who have suffered. Certainly our staff and our teams have gone through the same things. I've immediately announced I would take a 50% pay cut until we get out of this because the finances of our institutions are affected. But I think, like I've seen Japan Society and the World Affairs Council, we've stepped up to do more. And so even though we're all working from our bedrooms and living rooms and trying to figure this out, I think both of you would probably agree you've never worked harder. You know, on early in the morning through late at night. We're global institutions, so the time clock doesn't change. So in some ways, it feels like a fulfilling moment because, you know, we're there to try to make a constructive difference at this time.
Thank you. Obviously, just like Josette, I'm here in New York, and just being the epicenter where everybody keeps on coming to us and saying, how is it in New York? It's almost like the post-apocalyptic zombie or something. And as you said, we are working harder than ever. Bill, what's it like in DC to be in the political capital that took a little bit longer than New York, but still is on the front lines? How has this affected the World Affairs Council that we know is all over the United States, and you personally there in the nation's capital?
Well, like Josette and you, we're operating all from home. Our staff is quite small. We have 4, and we serve a network of more than 90 World Affairs Councils around the country, coast to coast, and Alaska and Hawaii. And really, I guess the 2 biggest things are that because we are on the news and paying attention to policy, we are all tuning in to the follies that tend to happen around 5 o'clock or so from the White House, and those very long press conferences drive a lot of the news cycle. They also drive the markets. This is a very interesting time for any organization. We've heard the word unprecedented used all over the place. It's unprecedented for me never to put a necktie on, and this is thank you for the first time to give me the opportunity to wear a suit coat in days or weeks. But that's, you know, a very first world problem. I mean, we are really not just in the midst of a totally epic health crisis, but we are also on the verge of a massive employment crisis, an economic crisis that is already rivaling not only the Great Recession, but the Great Depression. Just some numbers. In the last 4 weeks, 22 million people are unemployed and have filed for unemployment. That's the equivalent of basically the population of Taiwan. In the Great Recession, it was a little over 2 million. At the dot-com bust, it was just under 2 million. Early 1980s, a little over 2 million. The double-dip recession under Ronald Reagan, 2.6 million. You add up all these, stagflation in the mid-70s, a little over 2 million. Adding all of those up, you do not get to the 22 million that we've seen in this 4 weeks, and there will be more coming. And this means that what the Senate is doing and the House will do tomorrow, I guess, to extend and expand the relief for small businesses, which includes nonprofits, is crucial. And the Federal Reserve Bank and central banks all over the world are flooding their economies with liquidity, and it may not be enough. This is going to, I think, exacerbate inequality in our country. I think it's going to exacerbate inequality between countries, and how the U.S. exercises its leadership under these conditions globally will be very interesting to watch. That's principally what World Affairs Councils are paying attention to. But at the organization level, we just learned that we did not get our PPP loan. And we hope that the new legislation allows us to access what isn't even $100,000 for us to cover an 8-week period. Then I'm probably going to have to make some of the difficult decisions that obviously Josette has already made with her own salary and sacrifice. These are just mind-bogglingly difficult times. And what we're concentrating on to wrap up this introductory set of remarks is that, you know, we want to strengthen our network. And you know, part of our job is to represent and strengthen our 90 member organizations, but we also have to take care of ourselves, and figuring out how to partner with great organizations like yours in a new format, extending and increasing our programming digitally to serve all demographic groups, and to really learn how to fundraise online is going to be crucial for our sustainability.
Thank you. Josette, coming back to you, you talked about kind of the major changes and the kind of the way in which you guys jumped in immediately to use the connections and the network you created. Like you all, the Japan Society had been tracking this virus for a long time because it was coming from Asia to here. Kind of how has this affected not just kind of your programmatic areas that obviously when I go and look at your website, it's impressive to see just the virtual reach you have, but also in terms of kind of thinking through how this might change Asia society for the future, and what are some of the positive things that you think this has unearthed if the negative side is the financial and the health scare that we're currently going through?
Right. Really important questions. And at some point, Bill, we're going to have to ally to turn the tables on Joshua here to ask him about Japan Society. But, you know, listen, I think we will never go back to the old normal. You know, there's a number of things that have happened on the constructive side that have shown us that we can do business in a different way in the world, we meaning the whole world, but let alone our institutions that are really trying to always preserve the investment we get, to leverage it to do the most good. And so we've certainly learned, you know, that we don't have to travel across the world for a one-day conference or something. We can connect and it can be effective and in some ways more intimate, right? To be connected like this because we can see everyone's faces. And I started a global fireside chat with our staff around the world, and it feels very personal. And I think that's a surprise, right? And so now we're seeing a kind of multi-generational comfort zone in dealing with a virtual or digital reality. And that's bringing at least our mixed audiences online to these events in a new way. And, you know, saving some trees while we do it and saving, you know, the impact and the finances of our types of institutions. I think that's important. I think we've all had to feel and ask really deep questions about the relevance of our institutions in a crisis like this. None of us are part of a public health institution. That has been a real part of my work in the past and including now. I'm the UN Special Envoy for Haiti for $1 a year. But in particular, I was leading efforts to end a cholera epidemic, which we've been able to do over the past couple of years. And that public health piece, even though we are not medical or public health institutions, we know that public health, as you said, Bill, this is a crisis of unprecedented proportions, and all that happens around that requires the support of these, what we call track 2 organizations that can build those bridges and build understanding and make policy recommendations. And, you know, so we've been really looking at how to help leaders think through how to get through this, how to save lives and be relevant. I think that's part of what's happened, right, is, you know, this impact is hitting so many institutions, and some of the very beautiful things in our society, like the arts and others, will be hit hard. And we all have to ask ourselves, you know, what role do we play with humanity? And is there a reason why we should be supported over, you know, a hospital or an emergency operation right now, right? And I think building an understanding for all that goes around supporting the world as it goes through shock, supporting America. We're all American institutions. We all are here to help America navigate its world and to help understand that. And so at least for me, and I've done things that have a deep sense of fulfillment mission-wise in my life, like, you know, fighting starvation in war zones and different things. This is one of the most fulfilling periods of my life because the very purpose our institutions created seems to be more activated than ever.
You know, picking right up off of that theme, it does strike me that we are living through a once in a generational challenge. And, you know, you see all the memes about, you know, during World War II.
Hope once.
Yes, exactly. We only want to do this once. We don't have to do it again. But it is a moment where the entire world seems to be going through this together, unlike other moments in time where someone else suffered a famine, someone else suffered a global terrorist attack. We are now all in this together, which comes with a lot of the good that you talked about. But there's also the bad, which is there's finger pointing. And I think, Bill, You talked about the 5 p.m. press briefing. Up here in New York, we tend to like the noon or 11:30 press briefing that our governor is giving that's getting a lot of national attention.
Mhm.
But it seems that in some ways, regardless of your politics, this has brought out kind of the worst in the politics of our nation, but also more broadly globally, but it's brought out the best in our societies. I guess I wonder how you see that playing out with the World Affairs Council and the 90 chapters you have. What are you hearing from the field, and how are you responding to that as a leader of the organization?
Well, first of all, I should underscore that we are not only non-profit, we are nonpartisan, and we are known for nationally and locally convening experts and leaders to provide, sometimes it may be a particular perspective, but our goal is to present a diversity of views so that our public audiences and the members of local World Affairs Councils can make smarter decisions for themselves, whether they be business or electoral or social. I think that, you know, this COVID disease is shattering borders, and so is technology like Zoom and other platforms that are connecting us nationally and internationally. This comes at a time, however, when 96% of destinations are closed to tourism, and there are so many countries in stages of lockdown that, and some, like even ours, which are issuing potentially orders to ban entry from various countries. So, while bridges are being extended technologically, and unfortunately the bad side of medically, they're also being closed to people-to-people exchanges. The interesting contrast to a pandemic that is not as serious as this was in 2009, when the novel H1N1 pandemic is a flu virus spread, and this was generated in the United States, and it took President Obama and the Chinese leader at the time, Hu Jintao, to organize themselves to collaborate on policy solutions. And I think it's considered true that their collaboration hastened the development of a vaccine and limited the spread of a very deadly disease also. What is missing this time is that condominium. In fact, it's become worse. While there were generally interesting positive statements from the White House on President Xi's leadership, they have reverted to a very negative bashing, which it's not that the Chinese leadership is without deserved criticism for the initial handling of COVID. However, what is happening in our politics is, we're seeing Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate, try to out-hawk President Trump on China bashing, and this is immensely destructive, I think, not only at this time when we need to come together as nations to try and solve this however we can, scientifically, but also in the longer term, it's going to be very negative over the coming months. This is dangerous for Chinese Americans, it's dangerous for Asian Americans more broadly, and it's just plain wrong. So we don't like to get into criticizing leaders directly, so my comments are my own today. And our 90 councils are independent, self-governing organizations that happen to pay dues to us. But the way we're looking at the crisis is an opportunity to convene better and reach audiences that we haven't before. So in 2 weeks, for example, and I can spend more time on this later, because I know you have many questions, we're going to do kind of a week-long jamboree looking at, the theme is putting the world back together. And we're going to take the convening power of World Affairs Councils across the country to bring speakers and experts to bear on local issues, medical issues, all kinds of civic issues, and of course our bread and butter, which are the international issues. But I'm seeing this is going to be a very sensitive, the handling of the coronavirus as a policy issue is going to be pride of place in the campaign, and when I mentioned that the tensions are only growing between U.S. and China, which is going to define really this half of the century and longer globally. How do you work with a country if there is this conflict, if there is this bashing, which will be mutual when we have other problems like climate change, which require the two biggest carbon emitters to get to the same table and work things out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously all of us who've spent a lot of time in Asia think a lot about that character of crisis, which both in Japanese and Chinese has the kind of danger and opportunity. Right. And I think all of us are kind of pointing to the fact that we're trying to lead our organizations towards seeing the opportunity, but very mindful that sometimes on the political side, it's expedient to go for the danger side. And we've seen that in a lot of different ways. A lot of us, when we were looking at this crisis, COVID coming from Asia, we were concerned. And, when you think about the Olympics being postponed, you talk about unprecedented. It's the first time we're seeing that. So the way that leaders respond is going to affect all of us. And it's not a 2-week, 4-week, this could be a year and a half. So with that in mind, Josette, you talked about having a lot of mission-driven work you've done. You lived through 9/11, 3/11, famines. How does this rank with the other crises that you've looked at? How is this different? What are some of the lessons you learned in these other crises that you've experienced?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. Before I get to that, just to go back to something Bill was saying, our institutions were born at a time when the world really had no real formal ways of cooperation, right? And there was competition, but there wasn't cooperation. And we formed some tools in the world to assist in the cooperation side and the competition side. And both of those are going to be there. But just to say, if you unpack this crisis, underneath each layer of it is either a failure or something that had been done that has helped prevent more loss of life. So for example, when I worked as Condi Rice's deputy on economics affairs as the undersecretary, I was her negotiator for the G7, where we were negotiating control over the last petri dish of smallpox in the world. All of that requires negotiation. Nothing happens across borders on health, on epidemiology, on any of this without pre-negotiation. And most of this has happened over many decades. And there's a whole series of decisions or breakdown in decisions that allow for quick action or exchange. In addition, the movement of health equipment through borders, export controls on medical equipment, import controls, all of these pieces you see activating. And I would just say that even though there's no magic wand to fix it, when the tensions up high get strong, these systems crack apart at the edges. When there is cooperation, they can facilitate, and even then there's many blocks. But a lot of that are the practical work behind the scenes to try to make sure that lives are saved even in the mix of that. Just comparing it to other crises, I would say the worst one I've ever lived through that had similar dimension and scale was the world financial crisis and food crisis, which hit at the same time when food prices doubled overnight. As oil prices, today they're at $0 or $1 or wherever they are. If you remember, they were inching up to $150 a barrel, and that link between fuel and food and finance became so clear. And much of the world was thrown into really abject hunger and the inability to place orders for food globally. And so I was head of the World Food Program and literally had to help, whole countries like the Philippines and Liberia and Afghanistan place orders for food. There was no food to buy in the world. And so that affected it, but it didn't affect the richer countries at the same scale as the poorer. Today, you have every village in Europe, every village in the US, Japan, these major forces in humanitarian work in the world, all saying we can't even keep up with the demand in our own countries. And what Bill was saying is you got hit with the $1 trillion of requests for that federal help when they ran out of money. I mean, there wasn't enough. And this is America. We're a rich, strong country compared to most in the world. And so today, as the poorest of the poor countries seek help, I'm doing a lot of work with Haiti. They literally have no money to buy basic equipment to fight, this disease. Where do you go? And so I've never seen a crisis where it's affected the whole world equally, hard, where countries, even if they have resilience, are trying to find that resilience, and where much of the world is really looking toward a couple of countries that have keys to helping solve part of this. China produces more than 90% of the personal protection equipment in the world, most of the world's ventilators. That's where the sourcing is, key elements of the testing kits. So how do you, move the world forward with all these tensions and dealing with that? So I've never quite seen this scale. And, Bill, I thought you did a brilliant job just giving us the facts and figures of the dimensions of this, right? Because now it's way beyond a public health crisis and the human suffering. I think Governor Cuomo's done a good job of coaching us through, there's other dimensions to this, and a lot of it is the psychological impact and the loss and the grieving that so many people are going through. But we have to take that into account as we look at, that level of impact throughout the world. So the multifaceted nature of this, the truly universal impact in every place in the world is nothing like I've ever seen.
Thank you. Bill, you were a correspondent and you actually worked, I believe, in Japan during the 3/11 crisis. Any lessons from that or other crises that you kind of go back to? And do you agree that this is kind of unprecedented in your own words?
Well, I wish I could say that it was the 3/11 crisis, because then I'd be younger. But my years in Japan were 91 to 2002. So I saw the Asian economic and financial crisis as a reporter, and also, for that matter, 9/11, and mainly its impact on stock markets and bond markets around the world, as well as the politics and diplomacy that shifted, particularly with how countries approached Afghanistan and so forth. There is, as an observer, I feel privileged to have enough affluence that I can be here in my dwelling and have 3 meals a day and worry about things like my retirement account. When you think that most Americans have on average fewer than $1,000 in the bank, this is going to be a wrenching crisis for our country. And it doesn't really seem that yet, when people are itching to get back on, track to normal lives and work and all that. The protests that you're seeing here, this isn't by no means confined to, areas in the Midwest or South or wherever. Indonesia has protests, India has protests, and these are only going to accelerate as people find their livelihood really at life's survival level. So I've not experienced the scenes and the delivery of aid that Josette has. I have worked in as a volunteer for Red Cross disaster relief in Florida and Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, and even in my home state of Massachusetts. And I understand the dislocation that people in grave distress experience. And I just hope that the leadership of our legislators, our governors, and even our president can get us through this. And it takes collaboration. In terms of where this is going for U.S.-Asia relations, I think, again, a lot is going to be defined in the U.S.-China prism, but you're seeing different things happen even within the region. Japan and South Korea, how they relate to China, how they relate to each other. We have lessons we can learn from South Korea. For example, They just had a legislative election that was, gave their leader, President Moon Jae-in, a landslide victory. He's a liberal, and he has an agenda that he thinks now has a mandate to push through. They've been acknowledged in the global media as a success story for handling COVID. Now they have to address what was a very serious economic situation prior to the pandemic. And one thing that I think we can learn, if not from how they handled their health matter, is the electoral discipline and administration, where we're talking, we can't seem to decide whether we are going to allow mail-in votes and how people are going to social distance around the ballot box. We are the leading, or were the leading democracy in the world. We now need to take some lessons from those democracies that are performing in healthy ways and making decisions for their citizens with input from their citizens that's positive.
Thank you. Before I go to you guys for kind of a last comment, and I hope you can kind of frame this in the perspective of kind of what gives you hope, and then also what keeps you up at night. I'm going to ask you guys both that question, and then I'm going to turn to our audience that have been great at sending in their questions, so I want to thank them. Let me just take one point, a chairman's prerogative. One of the things Japan Society has been most proud at doing is setting up a 311, a relief fund. I think to many Americans, understanding what March 11th, 2011 did to Japan with the triple disaster, which was not just an earthquake, which many of us that grew up in Japan kind of expect, or a tsunami, but also the nuclear disaster that it led to, and just the kind of the soul-crushing nature of that horrific moment, where I also had parents that were there as missionaries and not knowing if they had survived. It was a transformative moment for me personally, but also for all of us that care about Japan. And what's been so heartening in this crisis, particularly in New York, where the world has been paying so much attention, is the interlinkages I see. We did a program with 9/11 survivors and 3/11 survivors and lessons learned. Those survivors now in Japan are organizing to send, the different face masks and PPE to New York, because they believe that if New York can emerge stronger, that here as the global capital of not just finance and arts and the media stage, that the world will be better off. It's not just for America, it's for the world in some way. So I've been particularly heartened to see that as a new leader that's come in and kind of has been inheriting this crisis and learning from leaders like yourself. So I just want to thank those members and supporters out there that have been supporting us on that. And just simply to share that those linkages go far beyond. So while we're in the crisis right now, what keeps me up and gives me hope is that spirit of resiliency. There's this idea of bending to adversity. In Japan, bamboo is considered stronger than an oak tree because it bends and it moves with the environment. So I think you're right to point out that maybe in the West, and particularly America, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Asia if we can take the humility and learn from our societies and not simply kind of take an egotistical view on that. So with that, let me turn it to Josette with your final thought, and then come to you, Bill, before I've got a series of great questions from everyone.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Joshua, for that inspiring moment there, and just really compliment you and the whole staff at Japan Society, but particularly since you've come on board, really activating that potential Japan has to help be a pace setter in the world. And I think sometimes, that story is not as well told in Japan's innovation and its approaches and how they've handled COVID and all of that. And we really appreciate when you're looking at it, connecting dots in new ways through your programming. So I'm certainly a fan and will continue to be. And I've seen what you're trying to do, which is really demonstrate these links, right, and the relevance of the Japan story to the United States and to the world. My dad, who was a Band of Brothers, 101st Airborne guy who jumped at D-Day, and he would raise me and he'd say, Joe, wars don't make men. They reveal who they are. Watch in a crisis. And, feel like I've been trained since I was young to really look and allow a crisis to tell us a lot of information about, leaders and leadership and where things really are. And I think this crisis has really stripped us bare, humanity, right? And I'm saying this, it sounds bad, but in a way it's good, because we're seeing new leaders emerge that have been truly inspiring to me. And it's across many, many sectors and across many, many countries where you see people really gaining comfort and leadership from people they've never heard of or connected to. And many of them just average folks who out of their home, are figuring out ways to do that, but also other leaders who were thrust into the moment and had to step up to the plate in new ways. So, this war, and it is a war, we really are fighting a battle for the stability of our societies and families and communities. We're seeing the men and women who can really lead. And Forbes just did a really interesting article saying the best performing countries are all led by women. And I think it's the first time we've really been through a global shock with that many women leaders in place who really had to step up to the plate. And so all these things to me are really inspiring because we've seen these leaders emerge. And I always also have this concept from, since I've been a child and coached by my dad, that you don't choose history, history chooses you. And so this is a moment, right, where history is being made. We all read our history books. We studied the Civil War or World War I, World War II, what happened, what didn't happen, what institutions were created, which tensions caused further friction and extended the suffering, and all of those things. And so in a way, I feel like the clock has slowed down as we look at the world being remade in a way, because in real time, we're seeing a crisis emerge. And, the US has always, since I think World War I, emerged as a real leader to help the world think through these crises. And we need to think in new ways about the kind of support structures to lift up our nation, our communities, but also the world, because we are interlinked, economically. And so I do think it's a time when, we want to not just be bystanders, we all want to do our part. Our institutions have through every war to do that and make sure the American voice is heard, but also that America can understand the best practices and the wisdom of the world. And so, this is in a strange way what inspires me, that there are organizations that can help with the resiliency of the world right now. And just knowing, the two of you, great leaders of really fabled institutions who I can turn to and say, how are you handling this? And what do we do? And can we ally together in new ways to get that done? And, Bill, I certainly want to offer our support to your global thought process, or your not global, very local, because we can't move without understanding what people in Kentucky and Ohio are thinking. And those who understand that America, is a great nation and has made it through every crisis with incredible resiliency. And we need that wisdom that you're tapping into. So we'd be honored to be, part of that.
Great, thank you. Bill, what inspires you? What's the last word from you?
Well, that was very inspiring right there, Josette. Thank you very much for that and for your kind offer. I'm grateful for that kind of partnering. I want to sort of pick up on what Josette said and also return to the prior question you had about, your being involved in crises. And I have observed a number, both in Asia and here. And I remember when the Kobe earthquake struck in 1995, that the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan was very proactive in delivering. Companies would deliver supplies and human capital. There were many volunteers who went down. And of course, that's a tragic, shocking event that happens. And then there's the aftershocks. And by that, I mean, not just the geological ones, but the economic ones and the social ones and people. There are mental health issues. And it was wonderfully inspiring to see the American community in Japan at a time when we were at the peak of our trade dispute with the negotiations between our countries on autos and glass and insurance and financial products. That a crisis that comes down to life and death is what brings us together. During That same year, there was the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system, which was an act of terrorism. And so the Japanese felt, before we did in 9/11, what can happen when crazy comes to your metropolitan global city, and the Japanese have a very interesting way of coming together and responding to crisis like that, which is determination and grit and organization. And you mentioned, Joshua, the March 11 triple disaster. I remember being at World Boston, our affiliate in that city, leading that organization then, and Peter Grilly, the director of the Japan Society of Boston, had a vigil in a downtown church that was extremely moving, and the philanthropy that came from Americans toward Japan, citizens, individuals, as well as what your colleague Kazuo Kato and her former colleague at the Sasakawa Foundation, Ambassador Jim Zumwalt, can relay better than I can about how USAID, the United States military, many organizations, many American organizations came through to support Japan at that time of crisis. We really do need the kind of global visioning from our leadership. I mean, I have to say, halting funding to the World Health Organization, which is charged with dealing with pandemics, is probably the worst policy, and I should not be a judge of policy. I'm supposed to be neutral, but that seems crazy. Josette mentioned the multilateralism. Where is that? We need that. There is action at the IMF and at the World Bank to provide financing and fiscal support for nations in distress. That's encouraging. We, the United States, and our allies after World War II built those institutions, and they need to be stewarded and restored, because that's the only way you can get at global crises like this. So my hope is that we remember the generosity of ordinary Americans in times of crisis and how they respond not only to their own but to other countries very generously. And we need to remember that our forebears built these institutions which make us effective leaders in the world. That's what we need at this time.
I really appreciate that. And I think emphasizing how our institutions in their own space and time when they're created really have served far beyond what any of us as individual leaders have, but we are collectively much larger. And when we think about the generations and the giants on the shoulders on which we stand, it's really a humbling experience, whether it's the 90 World Affairs Councils that do great work with the other Japan American societies around the world, or whether it's the Asia Society centers that are in so many other places. So, to go back to Josette's theme of history, I really want to thank you all for having this conversation, but it's not over yet, because I've got some great questions from our listeners and viewers here. But I just want to thank you both, and also kind of put a fine point on what a historical moment it is to bring these organizations. Japan Society shares the John D. Rockefeller DNA with Asia Society that Josette and I talk about all the time. World Affairs Council has that critical mission of bringing the world to these places, whether it's Kentucky or Ohio, as Josette said. And we actually have some questions from there. So let me start with a question that comes from Flora Williams of the Louisiana Supreme Court. She says, what do you see replacing or augmenting person-to-person exchange and soft diplomacy now and going forward? How do we make cultural programs and educational seminars that are webcast have the same impact as in-person events? Josette, you want to start there?
Yeah, so great question. And, my heart goes out to New Orleans and all that Louisiana's going through. What a great, talk about a cultural gift to the world that New Orleans is, and the music that comes from Louisiana. I remember my first trip to Japan when I was a student, and I went to see a bluegrass music, and oh my gosh, they worship, American country music and bluegrass. And if Americans could just see, how beloved so many of these traditions are around the world, and how deep these connections go, and the warmth, I wish everyone could see that. And also how people remember American kindness. And just to say, Joshua, my sister married a man from Japan, and I visited the village. I was the first Westerner to ever go there after they were engaged to bring a gift. And the family brought out a can of Spam from World War II that they had saved, promised to thank America if they ever met an American. And they brought it out on a tray, trembling with tears running down their face. Mm. And they talked about how during World War II, even though they were the enemy, Americans were there for them, and how they wanted to share this. And I assured them they didn't have to open this historic can of Spam at that moment. But, you know, that those bridges can't be made up. And right now, even though Americans are hurting so deeply, we are trying to find ways to connect, because I think we can give comfort not only within our own families and communities, but across, you know, these divides. We're finding that the digital actually is different, but can be intimate in different ways. And so the way that, you know, right now I actually feel like I'm talking to the three of you and to the broader audience, we're finding that it's not as distant and cold as we thought. And so maybe the new generation we're always yelling at, get off your phone, maybe there's something there where they've actually been connecting emotionally, you know, through this in a way that we didn't quite fully appreciate could be part of the toolkit that we could do. And so I'm very excited to think about a future where we don't put these huge barriers between, you know, plugging in with a village in Japan and saying, how are you doing, sister city? And getting people around the campfire, if you will, in a digital way, whereas maybe we would have tried for 10 years to plan the trip and raise the money and all of that. So, so thank you for the question. And I think a new world is opening up that actually, you know, will be quite powerful.
So Bill, I want you to expand on that, but I actually have an expansion from Bahai Simons Lane, who actually is from the U.S. JET Alumni Association. Oh. And she specifically calls you out and says, we have one of our speakers today is actually an alumni of the JET program. And her question that dovetails nicely with what we just heard about how do we make these in-person issues as impactful is, you know, as regular events shut down, the alumni associations have had to cancel planned events and shift their activities online, which has been a challenge for us as a lack of access to virtual meeting services requiring subscription and limited capacity as completely volunteer run organizations. What recommendations would you have to make these organizations more meaningful and to be able to engage in these communities where we have to have social distancing?
Well, Bahia, it's great to hear from you virtually, from alumnus to alumna of the JET program, one of the finest public diplomacy programs ever. You know, I'm getting, not today, by the way, this has been fantastic, and I want to thank both of you again for the opportunity to talk with you. The number of virtual happy hours is giving me some fatigue. However, I have a party mask, pineapple, and I have my black tie mask for when we go to virtual fundraising. It's quite a collection that I'm developing, but I think that, you know, with cultures, we can extend a lot of what we do, and to move off policy is a very important thing that I'm stressing to World Affairs Councils. Not that they ever follow me, but actually I follow them. I've noticed in our communications that from individual councils that they're sharing international recipes. People are advertising events like Andrea Bocelli's Easter performance at the Duomo in Milan. And there are aspects of pop music from Asia that I'm sure have been viral before this, but people who only heard about them can now get into it, right? I think, you know, we are at the World Affairs Councils, we're going through stages of convening. We had, first and foremost, more conference calls and gatherings among leaders just to assess the nuts and bolts of keeping our organizations going. Secondly, we're putting up events like the one you're hosting now, Joshua, as much as possible to share information about issues and strategies and new ideas. For alumni associations, I've had both undergraduate and graduate just gatherings. Those are the happy hour ones. But I think that, you know, picking elements of Japanese culture in this case to emphasize, whether it's you know, you could have a tea ceremony. You can, you know, calligraphy might be a bit silent, but there are language. What an opportunity today to learn a foreign language. You've got time, you've got the online tools, and if you have an alumni association and you've been returned to the United States, I mean, how about conducting 15 or 30 minutes of only Japanese conversation? That'll get you tired after being energized.
We're going to have to do that. I'll take you up on that, Bill. We'll drink some sake
Okay.
as we do it. My Japanese becomes better with alcohol. I have
Be
two
careful
questions.
what you suggest, I guess, is the lesson there.
We have two questions that focus on U.S. China relations. And actually one is from my boss, the chair of Japan Society, Joe Perella. And his question is, how do you think the behavior of Chinese leadership will impact on their ability to work with others? And then juxtapose that with Sherry from the city of San Antonio, who actually works for my good friend, the mayor of San Antonio, Ron Nirenberg, who also is the chair of Sister Cities. And she asked, have the dynamics of exchange and assistance as a result of COVID-19 produced any positive impact on U.S.-China relations? I'll start with you, Josette.
Big questions and tough questions. Listen, the puzzle pieces have been thrown up in the air, and I think countries have a chance to redefine their role in the world. And I have a particular obsession with the brand of countries. It's a fact that I've observed that when people look at the flag of a country, certain things are evoked, right? You look at the Swiss the cross and you think humanitarian, and Switzerland has secured that. And you look at the Canadian flag and you think about, you know, good governance and all of these things. The American flag really has stood for that freedom and independence and, you know, human rights and all those things that traditionally have motivated Americans, people coming to America. For China, you know, they've emerged into the world from, you know, vast poverty and vast challenges, and now have a leadership role. And I think this is a moment when they are defining who they are in the world and how they interact with the world. There will be, you know, there's certainly a whole effort at finger pointing and blame gaming and all of that. We are really urging that at the right moment, we can look at the institutions, the nations, and the role played and what worked and what didn't, and where there might have been failures or where things could have happened different. This will be very important. And there will be many PhD papers written about this very TikTok of the last, you know, 14 weeks of humanity. You know, for China to, there was a moment over the past month that, you know, without talking about the details, there was a real chance there would be a blockade of humanitarian goods between the US and China. And this, you know, in the moment of human lives being lost, these are things that would be remembered for generations. And you can go into the cause and why and how bad everyone, you know, whatever. But we really took the position that that has to be mended. Right now, it has to be about saving lives. And I think those forces in both nations really worked on that, right? And got that accomplished. And the telephone call between President Trump and Xi Jinping was very important, given the realities of the supply chain. So we are seeing, you know, history being defined literally day by day and moment by moment. And so it's a huge opportunity, but also it's a huge opportunity for nations or leaders to slip into feeling they weren't relevant at this time or weren't constructive problem solvers. On the second question was, is there anything positive happening?
Yep.
So I will say, you know, you saw the governor of New York thank Jack Ma. Interesting. The founder of Alibaba. His vision was born really out of what I think is a humanitarian need. In China, no one could get a loan to start a small business. That was the legacy of, the socialist communist past. There was no banking structure, there was no credit system. And Jack Ma was deeply poor individual who had this idea of being able to grant small loans and create a system where people could buy goods and it could be verified as, whether this was a real legitimate good or not. And that gave birth to Alibaba. Well, his gift of 1,000 ventilators to New York, there's a lot more behind that. He's done more. And as has Joe Tsai, who was the co-founder of Alibaba, who's a very devout New Yorker and owner of sports teams. But those moments are really amazing because sometimes it doesn't have to be between nations. It can be between, as you said, Bill, the Chamber of Commerce of the U.S. and Japan helping. The fact that some of these Chinese companies have stepped forward to say, we're with you, New York, we're going to help do that, I think has created, a very special moment. And then some of these moments like Lang Lang with the amazing singer from Canada, this joint performance that completely obliterates the cultural barriers and lets us be uplifted by that. I think there are some things that have happened that really will be indelibly remembered at the moment of crisis.
Great. I'm going to ask the last question that I think is appropriate for Bill. It's also self-serving given who it's coming from, but I want to apologize. We had all these questions, but if I don't end in 3 minutes, I'm going to lose my credentials as a friend of Japan given the timeliness issue. Bill, we have questions from across the Japan-American Network, and we have one specifically from Reina of the Japan-American Society of Hawaii, also Patsy Brown of Houston, Paul Pass of Dallas, and Peter Kelly of the National Association. It's a generic and a larger question, but it seems appropriate. How can Japan-American societies best contribute to a post-COVID-19 recovery, partnering and collaborating with Japan in this new world? You talked about it briefly, but I just want to give you that opportunity to talk in that sense.
Well, Japan has been a prominent donor of official development assistance to other countries. The Japan-America societies have built bridges across our two nations for a century. We need to highlight. I thought the earlier question was great about looking for what is positive, because we are in a sea of negative news, and there is so much that we can stress. The post-COVID world is so uncertain, and we are at the, really, we're not going to get there. We're going to be working through, I think, waves of this crisis. Therefore, I think the role of the Japan-America societies is like our own at the World Affairs Councils. And by the way, combining forces together is going to amplify what we do. We need to bring the best minds to bear to share experiences. They can be personal, they can be professional, they can be policy oriented. And I think there's, these 1 hour discussions for me are so valuable to hear what other organizations like the Asia Society and Japan Societies are doing. All I can say is I'm open to all form of collaboration. I think we need to concentrate on all the building blocks of our relationship. They're deep, they're complex, they're historic, and for generations now are grounded in friendship. That is gold. We've both had, both Japan and the US have had excellent public diplomacy and soft power in the past. We've got to husband that and spread it. And I use the word husband, and it makes me think of something that Josette said earlier about women leaders in the world today. One of the highlights or one of the things that's happening in this employment crisis that I mentioned at the very beginning is 1 in 3 frontline workers are women. And the need for women in the workforce is going to be so much greater. This could be a game changer that, we have been struggling to get to, in quote normal times. Good if it's a new normal, and that means that, everything from access to opportunity to equal pay and all of that comes to the fore, because Josette is absolutely right. This is the time when we need empathetic leaders, when we need leaders who are bringing people together and not, beating chests.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you, not only for just your timely comments, your leadership in this moment, but for this opportunity to come together. I know that we spend a lot of our time managing our internal staff, thinking about our own individual brands, but to show that we can all come together in this moment and to be true bridge builders in a moment of crisis where many are looking to us. It gives me great hope and inspiration to both know you and to have been able to spend this time together. Thank you both. Thank you for what Asia Society, what a World Affairs Council is doing. You heard it here first. We're going to spend more time working together. We've already heard the offer, and I will simply put my thanks in my offer to make sure that Japan Society is continuing to play that historic role of bridging not just the U.S. and Japan, but helping the U.S. and Japan in a more global context in Asia, throughout the United States and the world. So thank you, Josette, thank you, Bill, and thank you for the over 400 viewers that have tuned in for spending this time together with us. Thank you, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Josette. Thank you, Joshua.